traced it back to Ishtar and Astarte and various fertility goddesses. Well, Ishtar was the Egyptian version, and then she became the Phoenician Astarte, etc., etc. And so people said, well, that's the basis of the root. That's the root of the word Easter. But it actually seems, if we take a look at the early church, that they used the word early when the church moved into Germanic regions, because Easter and Wester were east and west, and the whole idea of the rising of the sun in the east was what they were talking about as the early church and the rising of the sun. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing to take a look back on that, and to see that little bit of information there that's makes you think, anyways. So anyway, we're continuing on with the lesson that we began last week, and we started last week to talk about the importance of living out our marriage Christianly as it pertains to communication. And as we talked last week, we talked about the fact that a Christian marriage is far more than just two Christians living under the same roof. That it is important for us to consider how we are going to construct our marriage in communication with each other, in sharing with each other in a way that is in keeping with Christ and in keeping with the character and nature of Christ. And as we look at that word communication, we talked about the fact that it means specifically sharing with or living with, co-munis, and munis is the root, the Latin root from which we get the word municipality. But I asked a few questions, and I'll just kind of revisit those questions. The first question that I asked was, I asked you to take some time and reflect on your private tone and private speech with your spouse as compared to your public tone and your public speech with your spouse. What it looks like when you talk to your spouse in private, where nobody else is viewing it, and how you speak to them as compared to how you would speak to them in a public space. And I gave you a bit of a thought experiment, and I said if there were CCTV cameras in your home and there was the possibility of you making $1 million for really, really kind of hitting it out of the park as far as speaking to your spouse well, with a tone and words that were considerate and were loving through the whole week, would you be more motivated by the big payoff than you are by valuing your spouse? And as I said to you, I think that that's a legitimate biblical thing to consider when we think, for instance, about the fact that in Proverbs 31 that it says that a good wife is worth more than rubies, an excellent wife is worth more than rubies, and so we've got this question that we ask ourselves, this thing that we consider: would the payoff be more motivation than the value of your marriage? Would it matter to you more to get $1 million, or would it matter to you more to build a great relationship with your spouse? And that was the one question that I asked you, and the other one was a reflection. And I wanted you to do a little bit of reflecting over the course of the week and ask yourself, do my words bless my spouse? And as we talked about that, what I meant by it was this: do your words, rather than being reckless words, rather than being words that would be doing damage to your relationship, do your words show affection, gratitude, admiration? Are they offers of assistance? And those were the kind of the four categories that I wanted you to think through. Am I affectionate in my speech? Does my speech express admiration? Does my speech express gratitude? Does my speech regularly express offers of assistance to the person that I love and I'm committed to? And it's an interesting thing as we took this lesson, as I taught it last week, because I actually got a little bit of a scolding from my wife afterward. Well, not really a scolding, because Joanne said to me, she said, you were kind of hard on the guys. She said, "You slanted it a little bit too much toward kind of picking on the guys." And I said to her, "Well, actually, I wasn't really trying to slant it toward picking on the guys. I was hoping that what was happening is that both sides would be taking a look at things for themselves and applying it to themselves." And I said, "And it's just easier for me to apply this to myself than it is for me to try and apply it to somebody else." Well, specifically you. So as we go through this, please understand that as I'm talking here, yeah, it's going to come from okay, I'm a guy, so what's my responsibility? What's the calling on my life in this? But as I say this, please understand it's a dual application thing. It's dual questions. I'm not trying to say this is for something for guys only to be thinking about, but this is something for us both to be considering. And so as we looked last week, there was a couple points that I was really trying to make in the midst of all those questions. The first point is this: your words can bless or they can bloody your spouse. So they can be those reckless words, or they can be those words that bless your spouse, that actually take and express things in a way that your spouse feels valued by you over the course of normal everyday speech. And the other thing that we began to talk about was the fact that controlling your tongue means that you're growing up. And that's a really, I said it that way because of the fact that when we take a look at what it says in James chapter 3 and in James chapter 1, it tells us very, very clearly that if you are going to be a complete person, then in order to become that complete, that mature, that whole person, you have a responsibility to take control of your tongue. You can't take a look at it and say, "Well, aren't I funny as I stick the knife in?" Because if you say, "Aren't I funny as I stick the knife in," what you're doing is you are actually showing that your tongue is set on fire by hell. Now, that's an interesting thing to stop and consider, because we're in a culture and we're in a time that really values the smart, snarky remark. It gets you the cheap laughs from the audience, right? It's the payoff. So it's a useful thing for us to stop and consider how we are affected by the culture and by the way that the culture views words. And it's something that we're swimming in it, so we probably aren't very inclined to think about it. And I'm not saying that we can't have fun with each other, and I'm not saying that there can't be playful teasing, and I'm not saying that we can't enjoy humor. But one of the things that we have to be very aware of is that the level of nastiness that's allowed sometimes, and even the level of just kind of popping off with a quick one that's really not very, very edifying, is something that we have to take and reflect on, and we have to think about carefully as we speak to each other, making sure that what we're doing is not damaging. And as we talk about controlling our tongues and what this means as far as growing up, I'm going to ask you to turn with me to James chapter 1. Familiar verses, I would imagine, for many here, but good words for us to return to, because James, again, I mentioned last week that James is in some ways a little bit of a parallel to Proverbs in terms of the fact that James's wisdom literature, even though it is an epistle, even though it's a New Testament epistle, it is wisdom literature. Much of what is stated in pithy sayings and in short snippets to cause us to think about what it means to live wisely as followers of Christ in the world. And so we read this in James chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God." And as we take a look at this, the lesson as we think about controlling our tongue that comes out of this is that we're called to learn to listen first. And in premarital counseling, one of the things that we talk about is this whole idea of active listening, of deliberately committing to listen to what your future spouse says, and understanding what they say and understanding where it's coming from rather than simply interpreting it. And this is something that we have to do carefully. And you can consider whether this is a tendency that you have, that you have your rebuttal prepared before you've heard the end of the remark of the person who's speaking to you. Because we've all experienced that in some sense, right? Where we've been in conversation with somebody and it seems like they've got their answer out before we've even finished formulating what we're saying to them. And when that happens, quite often what we do is we fail to communicate effectively and clearly and considerately with each other. If I do that, I know that I'm probably more intent on getting my idea across or getting my opinion across than I am on hearing theirs. And so this is where it's important. Now, I mean, I know that I tend to be a little bit slow in speech sometimes, so that maybe it seems like it takes a while for me to get things out. And Joanne and I, it's kind of a funny thing because she's quick and she's thinking about multiple things, sort of thing. And every so often, what'll happen is I'm a little bit slow in response, and I realize that and recognize that. But one of the things that we know is that it's important to hear the end of things before you actually are formulating your idea, and to have considered them before you come back with an answer. And in difficult conversations with your spouse, it's really useful to have a deliberate conversation with yourself in your own mind that says, don't talk right away. Listen and try to understand first. And I think that this is a useful thing to do because it's easy for me to start to formulate what I think or what I want to say before I've even made sure I understand the other person. Yes? Yeah. 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 Well, probably what happens is you you've got to say, okay, there's something I have to remember to say to you, but I don't want to butt in on what you're saying. So you might have to do something that alerts them to that, or you might have to say, I don't want to butt in on what you're saying because I want to hear the whole thing, but this is going to go away from me before if I don't. I did that yesterday by telephone with Joanne. She was at work, and there was something that I needed to phone her about, that I wanted to talk to her about, and she was at work, and I hated to butt in, but I thought if I don't give her this call right now, I probably will forget it later, and it's going to be frustrating for both of us. So I think again, probably simply the deliberate exercise of consideration when you need to bring something up. Whether it be that you provide for yourself some sort of way to remind yourself, or whether it be that you say, I'm not wanting to butt in, but here's something that I can't forget to tell you. So, and usually those things aren't as difficult as if it was just a matter of, there's a difference in intent, right? It's not the I need to talk over top of you. It's the this is important to our conversation and I don't want to forget it. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I think that's a good thing. And I mean, most of the time when we're in conversation, we're not conversing in monologues anyways, right? There might be a story being told or something like that, but typically our conversations aren't monologues with each other. So learn to listen first. And this is part of what it means to control our tongues and to be growing up in this. And then a second thing for us to think about, I want you to flip over with me to James chapter 3 as we consider our Communication, and this is with our spouses, but this is also with people around us. And probably it's a useful thing to bring it to bear when we think specifically of our spouses, though, because it is possible that the person who we've lived with the longest and are most familiar with is also the person who is most likely to hear things that flow away from careful speech. There are things that if your relationship is not as it should be communication-wise, there are probably things that you would say to your spouse that you would never say to another person. And that's a useful thing to think about. There are things that I would say to my spouse, shots that I would take at my spouse, that I wouldn't take at another person. And if that's the case, then it's a good thing for us to draw back and say, okay, well, let's think hard about this. And the second thing, after saying learn to listen first, is the second thing for us is to remember what heavenly wisdom looks like. And James says this in chapter 3, verses 17 and 18. He says, "But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace." And when we read those words, I think that probably those words would be convicting for any one of us. But not only are they convicting, I think that they're also aspirational. We want to be people who are wise. And as we desire to be people who are wise, we want to take a look at things like this and say, okay, so how then will I pursue wisdom in my speech? How will I make sure that what happens is my speech is skillful living in light of God's present reality? So as we think about this, it's possible in the course of being factually or strategically or morally correct to be wrong in our hearts and to be wrong in our manner of expression. You can say the most correct thing possible and do it in a way that is really destructive. And that's a useful thing. That's a useful thing for a guy like me who likes information and facts to think about. And one of the things that was useful for me early in our marriage was, and this was typically not so much between Joanne and I as it was just in my natural enjoyment of a good debate with people. It was a good thing to have a wife who, when she sat beside me, kicked me in the shin under the table every so often. And that kick in the shin was, just be a little careful how you say it. And it wasn't. She didn't leave that many bruises, but I mean, it was a useful thing. It was a useful thing to think about the fact that it's possible to say something that is entirely factually correct, and to do so in a way that is going to leave damage, because of the fact that we are not pursuing it with a heart of peace. And so, wisdom is described here as untainted. It's described as, when it says pure, that's what we mean. We say it's untainted, it's peace-oriented, it's gentle, it's reasonable, it's impartial. In other words, not tinged by selfishness, because you can use the truth selfishly, right? And so it's not tinged by selfishness. It's sincere. So it has genuine motives rather than motives that are manipulative or that are for the sake of getting what you want. It's mercy practicing, and wisdom that is from above pursues a good outcome. In other words, it desires to actually benefit the other person. So in all of this, I think it's a useful thing for us to think not only about the fact that we want to learn to listen first, but then to understand that we don't just listen to the end so that what happens is we've got all of the necessary stuff in order to be able to come back with a real great rebuttal. Because that's possible too, right? And instead what we see is we remember heavenly wisdom. And when conversation moves toward disagreement, we have to ask ourselves, how much does winning or getting my own way drive my words? That's a very, very important thing to consider. How much does winning or getting my way drive my words? And when winning or getting my way drives my words, then probably the nature of my speech or the way that I say things isn't going to reflect this wisdom that's from above. So we want to listen carefully, be swift to hear, and we want to make sure that what we're doing as we speak is that our speech is reflective of the wisdom that's from above. Ephesians chapter 4 verse 15 says, speaking the truth in love. And it's useful to remember that if in the course of conversation you sacrifice either love or truth, you're probably speaking neither. That's a useful thing to think about. Well, I'm just telling the truth. Well, then it's probably not going to be said in a way that's the truth in love. Or, I just want to be loving. Well, maybe you're going to avoid the truth in order to actually keep things comfortable. But when Ephesians 4 says that we are to be speaking the truth in love, we have to recognize that both of these things stand side by side. So we don't want to sacrifice either in the course of our conversations. The third thing for us to think about as we think about this is that as we look at that verse, Ephesians 4:15, that says, speaking the truth in love, it's a good thing to come to the end of that. And I'm going to ask you to turn over with me to Ephesians 4, because as we look at that phrase, we've heard that phrase, speaking the truth in love, many times. But when we look at the whole of the verse, we understand what our aim is. So we're careful to listen. We're people who seek to show heavenly wisdom in the way that we speak. And the final thing we understand as we understand heavenly wisdom is that Jesus is always our aim. So rather, speaking the truth in love, we're to grow up in every way into Him, who is the head, into Christ. Now, this is talking about the community of faith and how the community of faith lives with one another, and the fact that we should be people who speak the truth in love to each other with the intent of, with our aim being following Christ and looking to Christ continually. And you know, the whole what would Jesus do question is a good question to ask. I know that it might be something that was a fad for a little while, but the fact is it's still a very legitimate and very right question. What would Jesus do? How would Jesus speak? We used to joke in our house that when a Sunday school teacher asked a question, you were pretty safe if you answered God, Jesus, or the Bible. I don't know if you've ever heard that or not, but you know, if you're a little kid and the teacher asks a question, say, God, Jesus, or the Bible, and you're probably going to get it right. But there are Christians who choose only to think at the level of cliches and a surface level and shallow faith, and that's a big part of the reason why North American Christians and the church in Canada is so unhealthy, because it is cliched, because it quite often is surface level and shallow when it comes to thinking through what it means to follow Christ. But the opposite of this is that we often see vibrant churches and believers where there's persecution and hardship. And people whose lives are in danger for being faithful to Christ won't settle for a faith that's about playing games. They won't settle for a faith that's about being entertained. So in countries where the church would be persecuted, surface-level Christians abandon the ship. Here, surface-level Christians stay around all the time for all kinds of reasons. But those who have been forced to dig to consider whether their faith has real answers that really matter in life and death, dig deep to find those answers in the bedrock of his truth, and they cling to Christ. When you know that faith has real answers that really matter in life and death, then you dig deep to find those answers. And Jesus, in that case, is not a cliche answer. For those who are serious, speaking the truth in love so that we grow up into Christ is the deepest and fullest answer. Not Christ weaponized for our own ends, but Jesus Christ as the person that we know is the way, the truth, and the life, and the one that we want to follow. The more fully and deeply we seek to know him, the more we understand how we're to live. And in this case, we understand who we are to be as we share with our spouses. So our aim, as the aim is in Ephesians 4:15, the aim of speaking the truth in love is that we grow up into Christ. So we should be thinking about what it means to imitate and display the character of Christ in the way that I speak with and to my spouse. In fact, coming back to full circle to what we said at the beginning, if I want my marriage to be a Christian marriage rather than just two Christians living under the same roof, if I want my marriage to be a Christian marriage rather than just two Christians living under the same roof, I must be seeking to imitate and display the character of Christ in the way that I speak with my spouse. This is not an optional thing. So I have to consider carefully how I communicate with her. Even things like, do I stop what I'm doing and give her my full attention? That might be a picking on guys thing again, Joe. Do I stop what I'm doing and give her my full attention? I think that this is been an issue plenty of times for people in the course of the way that they are as husband and wife with each other, and I think that it's probably one that's going to be and accelerated as smartphones have become more and more an appendage. One of the things that I'm amazed at in the course of regular conversations, and I'm not saying that I'm dealing with it here. I don't actually end up dealing with it here, but as I've moved into more urban settings from time to time, I'm amazed at how many times when you go to talk with somebody, they're pretty comfortable having their phone and they're busy texting while they're talking to you. Or they're scrolling through things as they're talking to you. And you think about that and you think to yourself, okay, so in the course of my conversation with my spouse, am I giving them the attention that I should be giving them in order to say that they matter? And this is a useful thing for us. I hope I'm not stepping on any toes. Well, maybe if I am stepping on toes, please understand that the intent is not what can I do to really tick someone off here, but the intent is to say, okay, so let's step back and reflect on stuff that we've become like completely unconscious of doing. Because it's a good thing to step back and ask ourselves about stuff that's become so habitual that we're not even aware of it. It's a useful thing to reflect on our habits when it comes to how we treat that person created in the sacred image of God, given to us for a life of covenant together. Briefly then, how might it affect my communication with my spouse if Jesus is my aim and goal? Well, destructive speech is according to the flesh, and Christ points us to speech in keeping with the fruit of the Spirit. And when we think about that, it says the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, self-control. Would you say this is what your spouse hears? Do they hear from you love, joy, peace, long-suffering or patience, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, self-control? Do they hear that from you? Pastor Zeth is speaking again from Galatians 5. He's speaking from this particular area this week. Last week he started to speak about things, and as he was speaking about from this particular section, it talks about the works of the flesh. And I remarked on the fact that when you take a look at the works of the flesh, 8 of the 15 of those works of the flesh, or those acts of the flesh, first probably issue out in words. When it comes to the fruit of the Spirit, at least in part, it issues out in words too. So the question is, does your spouse hear reflections of the Spirit at work in your life? Does your spouse hear you speaking in a way that is deliberately about keeping in step with, walking in step with the Spirit? And the right answer to that question is not, she'll start hearing it when she starts talking to me that way. So, second thing, how might it affect my communication with my spouse if Jesus is my aim and goal? Well, where the culture has become coarse and familiarity breeds contempt, does my spouse see my words as considerate? Do I speak gratitude out loud? Am I encouraging? Because we do live in a culture that's become more and more coarse and far less considerate. I'm not sure if I told you guys about stopping in at Tim Hortons on my way to see Dorothy Wilcox, and I had some stuff to work on, so I got my coffee and I sat down, and I'm busy working on stuff, and 2 ladies in their late 60s, early 70s were sitting just over from me, and the F-bombs coming out of their mouths. I was just thinking to myself, I guess I don't expect that. But it's the coarseness of the culture. So we think to ourselves, okay, does my spouse see my words as considerate? Do I speak gratitude out loud? Am I encouraging? And the third thing, how might it affect my communication with my spouse if Jesus is my aim and goal? 1 Corinthians 13 starts out this way. It says, love is patient, love is kind. And as I think about that, because of course Christ is for us the epitome of love. Love is patient, love is kind. I think, is that the nature of my speech? Does my spouse hear from me speech that is in keeping with the character of Christ, that is patient and that is kind in its nature? So that's what I wanted to take a little bit of time to think about, and I don't think that there certainly hasn't been anything here that has been it's not shockingly deep. It's not like what I've done is I've come at you with some really, really hard theological stuff and said, okay, we have to think through some deep philosophy here or anything else. But we do know that it is something that requires us to think carefully as far as living it out is concerned. I remember years ago, Steve talking to me, my brother Steve talking to me, and at that point, Steve was working in Peru in South America, and he was working alongside of a guy named Bert Elliott, and Bert Elliott was a fellow who had a tremendous impact on the churches in Peru. He was the older brother of a fellow named Jim Elliott, who you might remember. Jim Elliott died ministering to the Auca Indians, or seeking to minister to the Auca Indians. But Bert Steve worked alongside of Bert, and they traveled all over the place, and they were involved in planting churches. And I remember him saying to me once, I thought that this was a very, very interesting thing. He said, you know, John, he said, I wouldn't call Bert a deep thinker, but I would call him a deep liver. And I thought, well, that's an interesting thing. Not a deep thinker, but someone who lives deeply. And for us as followers of Christ, I think that as much as anything is the challenge. You know, are we going to be people who, when it comes to our marriage and our life with our spouse, are we going to live deeply in the character of Christ, seeking to follow the character of Christ, and allowing that to reflect our words and our speech, and what it means to fulfill our covenant in relationship to our spouses? Okay, let's pray. Father, thank you for your goodness to us. We thank you for your truth. And Lord, we thank you for the beauty of your truth. The fact that as we seek to know and follow Christ, as we seek to grow up into Christ, as we seek to become mature and whole, we thank you for the fact that this makes so much of a difference in the shape and the nature of our relationships, and specifically of this primary priority covenant relationship you've given to us. And I pray for each of us as husbands, as wives, that we would be people who are desiring to live deeply in Christ in the way that we relate to our spouse. Lord, I think of the fact that it seems that so many times, so many marriages in our culture are characterized by deep relational problems. And we see how many marriages break up. And we recognize how simply, but how deeply, your truth is the answer. And I pray that we would be people who seek to pursue Christ, and that we would do so mutually, and that we would do so in a way that is reflected in our words and in our actions toward each other. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.